Lost for decades in Siberia, an epic true story. When Stalin's guns echoed through their village in 1936, the Lykov family made a desperate choice: vanish into the uncharted Siberian taiga. They carried nothing but a battered icon, a sack of seed potatoes, and unbreakable faith, and walked straight into a world where winter temperatures plummeted below -40 degrees Celsius, avalanches thundered down isolated slopes, and wolves circled close enough to hear their breath. No word of famine, revolution, or war ever pierced that endless forest. What horrors did they face when storms buried their cabin under 2 meters of snow? How did parents shield their newborns from starvation and frostbite in a land that refused mercy? Their disappearance became legend, until the day the wilderness itself unveiled their secret. You're about to witness a saga of faith, sacrifice, and survival that defies imagination. Flight into isolation. In the amber glow of a late summer evening in 1936, Karp Lykov stepped out of his modest farmhouse near Kursk, his gaze tracing the rolling fields that had been home for generations. He could still hear, in the hollow of his memory, the crack of rifle fire that had felled his brother just days before. That single shot shattered any illusion of safety under Stalin's watchful eye. As an old believer, one who clung to the ancient rites of Russian Orthodoxy in defiance of Soviet mandates, Karp knew the writing was on the wall. To stay meant persecution, or worse. Under a rising moon, he gathered his young wife, Akulina, and their 2 children, Savon, 9, and little Natalia, barely 2, and set forth on a journey that would carry them more than 3,000 kilometers from everything they had ever known. They carried almost nothing. In simple sacks went seed potatoes and rye grain, enough to plant a single season's crop, an oilcloth, wrapped icon of the Virgin Mary, a battered axe passed down from Karp's father, and lengths of hemp cord to fashion whatever lay ahead. They angled northeast, following animal trails that threaded through dark spruce and silver fir, keeping well away from roads or settlements. As the map of their past life faded behind them, the endless sea of Siberian taiga rose before them, an invitation and a challenge wrapped into one. Their goal lay in the foothills of the Albakan Range, a remote spur of the eastern Sayan Mountains around latitude 53 degrees 40 minutes north and longitude 89 degrees 15 minutes east. Here, the forest ran unbroken from hilltop to horizon, a living fortress of larch, pine, and cedar. Reaching their new home took weeks of trudging over moss-draped boulders, splashing through icy creeks fed by melting snow, and sleeping beneath a canopy of needles that whispered in every breeze. At no point were they nearer than 250 kilometers to the nearest village. When they finally paused beside a meandering mountain stream, they had entered a world defined by extremes. Summers cool enough that July's warmest days rarely topped 17 degrees Celsius, and winters so fierce that mercury plunged below -30 degrees Celsius for weeks on end. Rainfall averaged barely 430 millimeters each year, most of it tumbling down between June and September, while snow lingered for up to 7 months, insulating the frozen earth. With the first chill of autumn in the air, Karp and Akulina set to work. Using their single axe, they felled Siberian larch trunks to build a snug 4x6 cabin. Each log was painstakingly notched to fit, and gaps were filled with a mixture of clay and moss gathered from the stream bank. Inside, they fashioned a raised sleeping platform and dug a 1-meter-deep pit beneath it to store food and seed away from frost. Akulina wove baskets from young larch roots and braided hemp into strong cordage for doors, snares, and makeshift fishing lines. Just outside their new front door lay a roughly 50 square meters patch of alluvial soil, left over from ages of floods, which they cleared by hand. Karp planted the rye and potatoes in staggered rows, relying on long northern daylight to coax sprouts from cold earth. To stretch their supplies, they set wire snares for squirrels, sharpened wooden spears for grouse, and collected bright red cloudberries and dark bilberries that glimmered like jewels against the moss. When the first snow began to drift down, it was more a whisper than a roar, a thin veil of white over the dark forest floor. But within days, the flakes thickened, and Akulina hustled to reinforce their roof with extra poles. Karp piled logs around the cabin's exterior to form a windbreak against howling northers. Inside, He built a hearth of flat stones from the riverbed and stoked it with dried pine that crackled and scented the air with resin. Even so, the temperature hovered around -15 degrees Celsius near the fire. Beyond the walls, it could dip to -35 degrees Celsius without warning. In those weeks of deep winter, the family's entire world revolved around a delicate balance of warmth and hunger. Their diet consisted of boiled potatoes, rye porridge, dried berries, and the occasional grouse or squirrel they managed to catch. Aquilina preserved vitamin-rich fruits by layering them between sheets of birch bark in a smoking chamber above the hearth, while Savon hauled firewood all day to keep the cabin's single flame alive. Nightly prayers were said before the oilcloth icon, its painted face dim in the flickering light, a reminder that, despite everything, they were never truly alone. When the thaw finally came in late April, ice cracked on the stream, and frogs peeped from thawing wetlands. Carp shoveled aside frozen earth to retrieve buried tubers and dried meat, while Aquilina foraged for tender nettles and sorrel poking through the snowmelt. They built a small fish weir of bound sticks in a shallow bay of the stream and speared handfuls of minnows, marveling at the simple joy of fresh food. Over the next few summers, the Lykov family learned more about their environment than any outsider could glean from maps or climate tables. They discovered that cloudberries peaked in July, before late rains bruised the fruit. They tracked moose by watching for overturned stones, and they learned to read shifting wind patterns, southwest breezes that heralded spring's thaw and north winds that warned of an early freeze. Aquilina's nimble fingers transformed hemp fibers into sturdy garments lined with the soft inner bark of larch, prized for its moisture-wicking ability and warmth. Their home became a living chronicle of the Abakan foothills' seasonal drama. Meltwater swelled the Yerenat River each spring by up to a meter, flooding low meadows and replenishing wetlands alive with beaver and muskrat. Summers were fleeting. White-tailed deer sunned on rocky knolls under skies that stretched pale and wide. Winters arrived suddenly, dusting the trees in crystal, then deepening into weeks of unbroken frost. In June 1940, under a sky bright as a cathedral window, Aquilina gave birth to their son, Dmitri, inside that little log cabin. There were no doctors or midwives, just the soft glow of a tallow lamp and the whisper of prayers. 2 years later, in the frost-tinged air of September 1942, their daughter Agafia arrived, her first breath mingling with the scent of wood smoke and moss. These children, born in the heart of Siberia's wilderness, would never know the roar of tanks or the drumbeat of war beyond their forest walls. As the seasons turned, the Lykovs' world contracted and expanded around them. Their daily rhythms followed an ancient pattern. Dawn prayers beside their solitary icon, morning clears for chores or hunting, midday meals by the hearth, afternoon repairs and foraging, evening prayers and storytelling in the candle's glow. They measured time not by calendars but by the length of shadows, the depth of snow, and the chorus of spring frogs. In choosing exile, Carp and Aquilina had surrendered comforts but gained something few ever experience: a life defined entirely on their own terms, tuned to the heartbeat of wind through needles and the patient pulse of the seasons. Their flight into isolation was more than a retreat from tyranny. It was an embrace of a world where survival and faith were woven into every breath of icy air and every silent snowfall. Survival in the wilderness. When the snowmelt first trickled through the taiga floor, the Lykov cabin came alive with purpose. Moss-cushioned wood smoke curled from the stone hearth as Carp and Aquilina mapped out the year's delicate dance between feast and famine. Spring in the Abakan foothills meant more than the slow retreat of ice. It heralded a narrow window, barely 3 months, when rye and potatoes could sprout in the thin, acidic soils he'd wrested from the forest edge. They tilled the earth with hand-sharpened wooden spades, turning over patches of black loam warmed by relentless midday sun. In mid-June, when temperatures crept into the low teens, rare highs around 15 degrees Celsius, they planted seed potatoes in furrows 20 centimeters deep, spacing tubers so each plant could draw moisture from the slowly warming ground. Between the rows, Aquilina sowed rye, its slender shoots reaching skyward in a chorus of green. Any misstep, a late frost or a summer drought, would mean ruin, so each morning Carp padded outside, boots still wet with dew, to inspect every shoot for signs of wilting or frost damage. Beyond their cultivated plot lay the wild pantry of the taiga. By July, cloudberries glowed like lanterns against the peat, and blueberries carpeted the mossy undergrowth. Aquilina, nimble-footed and patient, knew exactly when to harvest. Too early, and the fruit tasted sour. Too late, and rains would bruise the delicate flesh. She dried handfuls of berries over the hearth, layering them between birch bark sheets that breathed humidity away, yielding a portable source of vitamin C that would stave off scurvy come winter's long night. Hunting was a family affair. Savon, now a lanky teenager, stalked through stands of Siberian fir with a simple bow Carp had carved from you, its string braided from hemp fibers. He lay in ambush beneath drooping branches, waiting hours for a ptarmigan or squirrel to wander within range. When the moment came, Savin's arrow flew straight, felling the bird with a soft thud against the fallen needles. Natalia and even young Dmitri learned to skin and dress game under Aquilina's watchful eye, each step a lesson in turning raw flesh into nourishing broth or smoked jerky. Fishing supplemented their protein. In the broad, shallow pools of the Yerenat River, they fashioned weirs of bound sticks and peeled willow saplings into spears. Come August, when runoff swelled the stream by nearly a meter, schools of minnows and grayling darted into the channels. Trapped by their simple traps, they provided fresh meat that the family roasted on a split-log spit above coals. These communal meals, shared beneath the cool canopy of larch, became rhythm and ritual, binding generations together in stories and laughter even as they reminded each other of nature's whims. As summer waned, the Lykovs worked in fevered preparation for the months ahead. Carp covered their root cellar pit with a heavy hatch of planks and moss, sealing in the last of the harvest. Aquilina wove new blankets of hemp and lined them with soft larch inner bark, prized for its ability to wick moisture and trap warmth. Each tool, from their solitary axe to the dozen wooden bowls carved from birch, received an inspection and repair. Even the cabin's seams were rechinked with fresh clay and moss to hold out winter's draft. By October's end, snow drifted into towering banks. The family retreated indoors, and a hush descended on their world. Timber harvest slowed, foraging ceased beneath deep drifts. Their food stores, dried berries, smoked meat, potatoes, and rye flour, had to stretch through what might be 8 long months of cold. Each week brought its own test. A thaw that froze deep into the pit, rendering potatoes into a solid block. A spike of -40 degrees that turned breath into ice crystals. A sudden blizzard that buried their firewood in drifts up to 2 meters high. In the cabin's flickering glow, they sustained themselves with rituals as much as recipes. Before each meal, they touched the oilcloth icon and offered thanks for what they had. By candlelight, they read psalms in the old dialect, a balm against isolation. Savon entertained Natalia and the younger children with shadow plays on the wall, his fingers tracing the shapes of wolves or elk, while Aquilina mended blankets and knitted small socks from hemp threads. Then came the winter of 1961, a season so merciless it would carve itself into the family's memory forever. A record snowfall, while over 1.2 m by late December, pressed raw weight against their cabin's roof. 2 thaw-freeze cycles shattered their ice lens, freezing the entire root store into impenetrable ice. Firewood supplies dwindled to dangerous lows as Carp risked venturing into the blind whiteness to fell standing snags. Storm after storm howled through the chinks, rattling logs and coaxing drifts into the hearth's doorway. Food ran perilously low. Rations were cut to a single bowl of rye porridge for each person every other day, supplemented by a handful of dried berries and thin slices of smoked squirrel. The children's cheeks hollowed, Savin's hands shook with cold. Aquilina, ever motherly, watched each of them consume their share, then quietly set aside her portion. Day after day, she coaxed smiles from Natalia, stitched socks for Dmitri, and hummed hymns that echoed like comfort against the wind's roar, while she herself went without. When spring finally trickled back, it found the cabin less than half breathing. Aquilina's blanket lay folded at the foot of her pallet. Her frame, slender once from decades of foraging, had thinned to a shadow. Carp held her hand as dawn broke over snowbanks, tears tracing frozen lines down his cheeks. In giving up her own strength, she had ensured her children would live, her sacrifice weaving a final testament of love into their story. Grief did not halt their labor. With heavy hearts, they buried Akulina beneath a blanket of snow that later slipped away to reveal spring's first fringes of green. Carp and the older children harvested what little potatoes remained, and Savon led foraging parties for early nettles and dandelion greens. Their prayers now carried an undercurrent of remembrance, each breath offered in her honor. In the decades that followed, they rebuilt stores, replanted fields, and taught Agafia, now a spirited teenager, every skill her mother once mastered. They kept count of snow depths, river flows, and berry yields as though charting Akulina's legacy. Under their careful stewardship, the cabin and its surrounding clearing became more than shelter. It was a living memorial to endurance, to the knowledge that survival in the Siberian wilderness demanded not only muscle and wits, but the quiet strength of a mother's heart guiding every choice. Through every frost, every hungry pause, the Lykovs sustained themselves on a blend of practical craft and unwavering faith in the land, in each other, and in the conviction that, even in the coldest depths, the human spirit could endure. On a clear morning in August 1978, a bright yellow Mi-8 helicopter appeared over the taiga, kicking up swirling snow of larch needles. Two Soviet geologists, charting mineral prospects in the remote Khakassia region, around 53 degrees 40 minutes north, 89 degrees 15 minutes east, peered out the open door. Below them lay the familiar sweep of dark conifers and moss-clad boulders. But nestled in a moss-lined clearing beside a meandering creek was something extraordinary, a plume of smoke rising from a simple log cabin. The pilot hovered low enough for the geologists to catch sight of four figures moving about the clearing, tall and lean, faces weathered by decades of wind and sun. They wore layered hemp clothing and fur-lined boots that looked centuries old. One of the scientists tapped his companion on the shoulder. "Do you see that?" he whispered. "People, at least a half-day's hike from any road." When the helicopter landed in a small meadow just uphill, the clan, for the first time in living memory, saw strangers. Carp, now gray and bent, but still steady of gaze, stepped forward. Behind him stood Savon, the eldest son, tall as a pine sapling, Dmitri, mute and solemn, Natalia, her braided hair streaked with white, and Agafia, a curious 15-year-old clutching a woven basket. Language barriers melted quickly. The geologists spoke in measured tones, offering tea, sugar, and bolts of colorful cloth. In return, Carp presented his battered icon of the Virgin Mary, wrapped in oilcloth, as though extending a sacred handshake. Over steaming cups of herbal brew, made from pine needles and wild mint, the two worlds bridged, the modern and the medieval, meeting beneath the endless Siberian sky. A world apart meets rapid change. The geologists returned to Moscow with sensational news. A family that had lived totally off-grid, awake only to the pulse of seasons, unaware of Sputnik, World War II, or the moon landing. Reports described their home at roughly 1,200 m above sea level in a DFB climate zone, summers barely touching 17 degrees Celsius, winters diving past -40 degrees Celsius, annual rainfall under 450 millimeters, and snowpacks that lingered for 8 months. Readers back home marveled at their layered hemp garments, bark-lined boots, and hearth-warmed pierogi made from their own rye flour. Documentaries followed. One crew filmed Agafia's nimble hands plucking cloudberries from the dew-damp moss. Another captured Savon teaching his young nephew to set a grouse snare. Yet with each return trip came hidden consequences. The distant world carried unseen germs. By 1981, the first wave of post-contact despair struck. 3 of the Lykov children, Savon, Dmitri, and Natalia, fell ill with respiratory infections. Lacking antibodies to common viruses, their bodies weakened rapidly. Snow drifted outside as Savon slipped away first, his strong frame gone in a matter of days. Natalia and Dmitri followed within weeks. Carp, heartbroken, wrapped their woven shrouds in birch bark and buried them hand-digging in frozen soil. Agafia, now 17, felt the weight of history press upon her young shoulders. Alone with her parents, she took on chores the older siblings once bore, hauling firewood in waist-deep snow, dressing traps for squirrels, and tending the potato pit. Yet her eyes carried a quiet resolve. She had tasted both worlds now, and she understood the value of her inheritance. An unlikely lifeline. After the loss of 3 children, the geologists doubled back with medicines, antibiotics, quinine, and iodine drops, along with tin cans of condensed milk and sugar. Karp accepted these as gifts from Providence, weaving them into his store of survival tools. Springs now found bolstered stocks of sugar in the root cellar, a small luxury sweetening the harsh days. Over the next decade, Agafia formed a bond with visiting researchers. She learned to write her name in Cyrillic on scraps of paper, to recognize the names of seasons in Soviet almanacs, and to understand the concept of years beyond counting snowfalls. Yet she remained deeply rooted in taiga ways, reading psalms by candlelight, weaving flax into rope, and marking time by the length of daylight on the cabin's mossy roof beams. Farewell to a patriarch. In 1988, at the age of 90, Karp's unflagging spirit finally gave way. He felt the weight of decades of toil in his joints and heard the distant rumble of thunder in his chest. One summer afternoon, under a slate-gray sky spitting rain, he gathered his family. Aquilina was gone, and placed the icon on his lap. With a fragile smile, he whispered a final prayer, thanked the taiga for its gifts, and closed his eyes. Aquilina's final years had been spent tending fields and teaching Agafia every stitch and prayer her heart could hold. Now Agafia found herself alone in the cabin she had grown up in, a solitary steward of a centuries-old way of life. Agafia's choice. By 1990, logging roads crept closer to the once remote clearing, and ecotourism operators eyed the region's pristine beauty. Offers came. A chance for Agafia to move to the nearest town, over 200 kilometers away, to attend school, to trade her hemp garments for jeans and t-shirts. But Agafia refused. She baked black rye loaves in her stone hearth, sewed new hemp coats from harvested fibers, and taught herself to read with the almanacs the geologists left behind. Each dawn, she climbed to the rocky promontory her father once used as a lookout, breathing the same pine-scented air. She rang a makeshift bell, crafted from scrap metal, to mark morning prayers, her voice rising in clear, confident tones above the stillness. Living tradition. Into the 2000s and beyond, Agafia became a bridge once more, the lone guardian of the Lykov legacy and an ambassador to scientific teams, photographers, and curious travelers. She guided visitors through her foraging sites, pointing out cloudberry patches and explaining how a thaw-free cycle in March could spell doom for the spring plantings. She described summer thunderstorms that shook the cabin's roof and winters when the snowpack crested 2 meters, trapping her inside for days. Despite outside attention, she never abandoned the rhythms her parents had set. Each solstice, she lit a candle before the icon. Each equinox, she sowed a fresh patch of rye. In her small diary, scribbled on birch bark pages, she recorded seasonal temperatures, rainfall, and the dates of first frost. Scientists now consult her notes when studying climate shifts in the Siberian taiga, a legacy carried forward. Today, with her hair silver as birch bark and eyes bright as morning frost, Agafia stands between 2 worlds. She preserves the tales of flight and survival, of loss and devotion, and shares them as lessons in resilience. Her story reminds us that isolation can forge extraordinary strength, that nature's harshest extremes can be met with humility and ingenuity, and that a single family's choice to seek refuge in a silent forest can echo through time as a testament to faith, love, and the unbreakable bond between human and land.